By April 1945, over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers faced a starving German line along the Oder River, more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns against a force running out of fuel. Commanding what remained stood Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici. Within 4 days, one of his armies would be broken beyond repair, and its commander would watch it happen from a hill he could not hold. Heinrici had chosen his ground with real care. The Seelow Heights rose steeply above the Oder floodplain, fortified across 3 defensive lines stretching 25 kilometers deep. His engineers went further still, releasing water from an upstream reservoir until the plain below turned into an open swamp, a trap built almost entirely from terrain and timing, designed to stop Soviet tanks dead before a single Soviet shell had even been fired. At 5 in the morning on April 16, 9,000 Soviet guns and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire together, hurling 500,000 shells in 30 minutes. Zhukov had ordered over 140 searchlights switched on to blind the defenders below. Instead, smoke and dust thrown up by his own bombardment reflected the glare straight back, blinding his advancing troops and turning every one of them into a silhouetted target. The flooded ground did exactly what Heinrici intended. Soviet armor bogged down in the mud, and for 3 days General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army, barely 110,000 men, held against nearly 1 million Soviet troops. 10-1 in soldiers, 20-1 in tanks and guns. By any normal arithmetic, Busse's line shouldn't have survived the first afternoon. It held anyway, forcing Zhukov to seek another way through. By April 18, Zhukov pushed north around the main German force, only to run into the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland and the 23rd SS Panzergrenadier Division Nederland, foreign volunteer units thrown in as a last reserve. Behind them, King Tiger tanks of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion counterattacked straight into the advance. It was the hardest fighting of the battle so far, and it still wasn't enough to stop the advance. Zhukov's front pushed 3 to 8 kilometers into the German position that day, and by nightfall it had finally reached the third and final defensive line. The next morning, April 19, that line broke completely apart. Soviet forces smashed through what remained of the Seelow defenses and poured into open country beyond it. Between them and Berlin, there was now nothing left standing in the way at all. The price of those 3 days was staggering on both sides. Soviet losses at Seelow ran past 30,000 killed, with hundreds of tanks destroyed or disabled in the mud and minefields. Busse's Ninth Army lost 12,000 men and nearly every tank it had left. The survivors pulled back in scattered pieces, some of them, exhausted and under strength, would soon regroup for one final fight inside Berlin itself. This wasn't a Green Army stumbling blindly into its first real fight. The First Belarusian Front had spent the previous year smashing through German lines across Belarus and Poland, the Bobruisk Offensive, then the Warsaw-Poznan operation, each one tearing bigger holes in the Wehrmacht's crumbling Eastern Front. Under Rokossovsky, then Zhukov, this front had been winning for a year straight before it ever reached the Oder. Now that momentum reached Berlin's gates. On April 20, Hitler's birthday, Zhukov's guns reached Berlin itself, opening fire on the city center from the east. To the south, Marshal Ivan Konyev's First Ukrainian Front tore through Army Group Center and pushed into Berlin's suburbs, while a third Soviet force closed the ring from the north. After Seelow and the victory at Halby, Berlin was no longer being approached. It was being surrounded completely. Inside the ring, the defense was falling apart even as it formed. On April 23, General Helmuth Weidling took command of what was left in Berlin. Regular troops mixed in with the Volkssturm, older men and teenage boys handed rifles and told to hold a city built for millions. It was, by any honest measure, the Reich's last organized force. There would be no others left behind it. By May 2, it was over. Berlin, the capital Heinrici had spent his last reserves trying to protect, the city Busse's shattered Ninth Army never reached in time to defend, had fallen completely into Soviet hands. The Battle of Berlin, and with it the war in Europe, was finished. What began with 9,000 guns on the banks of the Oder ended in the rubble of the Reich's own capital. Seelow Heights is remembered today as one of the last set-piece assaults on a heavily entrenched position in the whole of the Second World War, fought the old, brutal way, at a cost of tens of thousands of lives, to open a road to a capital that would fall 2 weeks later regardless. The heights are quiet now. In April 1945, for a few days, they were the last wall standing.